Hello YouTubers! As you can tell by what I'm wearing, it is still really cold where I live. Today we're going to take one winter essential, slipper socks, and upcycle them after they've gotten worn out and full of holes into a different winter essential, a pair of mittens. I wanted to do this because trying to reduce waste, trying to reduce textile waste, more importantly, these socks were just too cute to throw away once I started getting holes in them. So I wanted to turn them back into something I could use again, and turning them into mittens works well because all of the places where the holes have developed either gets covered or the hole in the heel gets cut off. What you'll need if you're following along at home is a pair of thick old socks that are big enough to cover your hand and have holes in them so they're bound for the trash otherwise. You'll need some paper and something to write with because we'll be making a pattern for the thumb and a pattern for the palm covering. And then you'll need some fabric, really doesn't matter what. I happen to have this orange neoprene in my stash that I got for free. This is a great choice, one because it's warm and two because it doesn't fray. You can use something that frays, you'll just need to be careful when sewing it on to the mitten. Really any fabric that'll be fairly durable would work just fine. Let's get started. So I could measure this to match the left hand exactly. What I did to figure out the length to keep for the left hand was really just putting my hand inside the sock and gauging where the butt of my palm is, and then leaving a little excess seam allowance. But now that we have the first one, I think I will do my best to get them about the same length. So that puts me right at this heel hole. So I'm just going to cut right above that with fabric scissors. If you're using slipper socks like I am instead of regular socks, you will find it's a little bit of a pain should you have to cut directly through one of the rubber dots. So don't toss this. We're going to use this excess fabric for the thumb, and we're also going to keep this piece to become the cuff of the mitten. So because this pair of socks is actually two layers, this decorative outer layer and then the fluffy inner layer, I'm going to try to pull this through, this excess through, so that I don't have this fluffy piece down at the wrist, because I don't need that. I just need this ribbed wristband portion. Okay. And now I really just want to keep this ribbed portion. On the left hand, I actually left more excess than I would have liked, just with the way that I sewed it on. So let's see if I can improve upon that with the right hand. So I'll go ahead and cut it off with a little excess for seam allowance. There we go. And am I worried about the edges of this fraying? Not particularly, because where the holes have formed in the heel and such over time, the sock didn't suddenly fray and fall apart. So, same idea here. I'm not expecting these cut edges to suddenly fray and fall apart. So now I'm going to put right sides together so I can sew them and have an invisible seam. Does it really matter where I line this up? Not really. So I'm actually going to put this seam, because it's a little bit bulkier, over here towards where the thumb will be, just so it's not like poking the back of my hand when I wear it. Okay. I could pin this in place, but I'm going to use some clips instead. I'm doubling my thread for strength. As far as thread, just whatever you got laying around. Again, we are upcycling a pair of socks. So, this really doesn't have to be perfect or exact or use the finest of materials. Alright, that's getting too small to work with. So let us tie a knot and get a new piece of thread. If you have questions and while I'm going through this, feel free to leave them in comments and I will respond, or more likely direct you to somewhere that's explaining it better than I could. And then something I've gotten better about doing now that I'm cross-stitching more is actually using thread conditioner, which is kind of a waxy substance. Some people, I know my grandma would just run her thread across a candle. That works too. Just to help it slide through the fabric and not get stuck or get tangled or knotted. That's the idea. Okay. So now we've got a cuff. Boom. Let's turn this guy right side out. Ta-da! So cuff attached. Now we need a thumb. Because I've only made this one, I already have some improvements we can make for the right hand now that I've made the left hand. The first of which being that the thumb pattern is too narrow. To create the pattern for the thumb piece, I traced around my thumb on a piece of paper and then added about a 1/4 inch around that, both for seam allowance and for the bulk of the fabric because the inside is so fluffy. But that 1/4 inch was still not enough room. So for the right hand, I think I'm going to remake the thumb pattern but make it even a little bit thicker. Outer piece of fabric doesn't have a seam because it was knitted in the round, so there is no kind of seam, but the inside piece is actually sewn and does have this seam here. So since I need to cut this open to be flat so that I can trace this piece onto it, I am going to need to cut it open somewhere, so it makes sense to cut it open where this seam is so that doesn't show up in the piece of fabric that's going to become the thumb. Which way are the hearts going? Are the hearts going up? Yes, hearts are going up. So let's match that. Make sure the hearts point up. I'm marking out with a permanent marker where I want this thumb to go based on where I think my thumb is when I put my hand inside of this sock. And do I care that it's on the outside and it might show after I'm done sewing? No. No, I don't care. And then when I cut this out, I'm not cutting a circle. I'm actually cutting straight lines across the diameter of the circle in a few different places because I'm basically creating a seam allowance with slashes in it already. I'm basically clipping my corners ahead of time so that I actually have fabric of the mitten to attach the thumb to. So now, similar to sewing on the cuff, I'm going to flip it inside out and put right sides to right sides and sew this thumb on. Oopsie. You can see I'm bleeding on my left pointer finger. It's not a sewing project unless you draw blood once. So maybe this means I won't draw blood the rest of the time as we finish these mittens. The next step is to cut a piece of fabric, in my case neoprene, to cover the palm and finger portion, mostly to cover all those wear spots from when this was a sock. I still have my pattern that I created for the left hand mitten that I could use for the right hand mitten. Just for the sake of this video and how I did it, let's make a new pattern for the right mitten. So measuring, in my case, what's about 4 1/8 inches across at its widest and about 4 1/2 inches tall. Then I want to curve this off at the top, and I'm going to err on the side of being too square because we can always trim a little more off. And same with the spot for the thumb. You can always trim more off. So a little too square. The thumb portion is actually not bad. This time I've gone too low. The change in the thumb, I've gone too low. So give that another shot. Once I think I have certain areas correct, I'm curving off the sharp corners like you see on the previous pattern, because I don't want to have any sharp points that might stick up out of the whip stitching holding it on. Having everything rounded will make sure there isn't a particular point of weakness that's pulling away from the mitten. So how far am I too short on this previous one? Not too bad. 3/8 of an inch. Alright, that looks way better. So now that we've got a pattern ready to go, I'll pin it onto the fabric and cut neoprene. So now I am whip stitching all the way around the outside of this topper fabric, and then we'll be done. To keep from sewing the mitten shut while tacking on this piece of fabric to the outside of one side, I'm trying to puff out the inside of the mitten so that the two sides of it are separated, the front and the back. And to do so, at least for right now, I have stuck a computer mouse in it. You can fast forward and see how that worked out for me. Now you might be able to tell that I'm stabbing pretty far into the mitten before I come back up through the neoprene, and that is because this mitten has two layers, the outside knit layer and that fluffy white layer on the inside, and I want to make sure that I'm catching both of those layers with each stitch. And to be extra certain of that, every so often I'm actually stabbing through to the inside, sending the needle all the way through to the inside, and then taking it through, and then pushing it back up through just the, through the mitten and through the neoprene to the outside, so that every so often I am absolutely guaranteed that the stitch I have just made went through all layers. But time-wise, it's just not feasible and probably not necessary to do that on every single stitch. One thing I should mention, as you can probably watch me struggle through whip stitching this piece on, is that this is not easy. It's finicky, it's slippery, my stitches are uneven but, secure. This would obviously be so much easier if we had started with flat fabric and this piece could be machine sewn on before the mitten itself was assembled. But something I've tried to remind myself if I'm getting frustrated with or if I'm getting discouraged with these upcycling projects is that upcycling or making something new out of something that already exists is going to be more difficult than making something from scratch. It's going to be more fiddly and difficult to work with because you're not starting with what people typically start with to make a pair of mittens or to make anything, not just in sewing. I don't want to let that be enough of a demotivator that I stop trying to reduce waste and stop trying to find new ways to recycle things. So I hope you'll keep that in mind as well if you embark on upcycling endeavors or refashioning endeavors. I mean, the one thing it does do is kind of working within constraints, like here you are, you have a pair of old socks, what can you make out of them? As opposed to you have access to any of the fabric and thread and notions in the world, what do you make? Like that can be kind of paralyzing, but having constraints on your next creative project, and artists do this all the time, like giving yourself rules or limitations or a weird starting point can lead you to ideas, projects, outcomes, methods that you wouldn't have come up with otherwise because you wouldn't have thought to do it that way. So all that to say, if this is getting frustrating or fiddly or you think it looks bad or whatever, don't get discouraged. It's all part of the process. And it's not, you in particular having an issue. It's kind of universal. Definitely recommend a thimble if you've got one for pushing the needle through if you have to pass through one of these rubber dots. If you are using a pair of socks that wasn't originally slipper socks, then you've got nothing to worry about. And there are the finished mittens. Overall, I'm super happy with how they came out, and I know I'm definitely going to be using them to walk the dog on some of these really cold days. They're not perfectly symmetrical, and that's okay. They work, they're warm, they're going to be machine washable. If this inspires you to make something similar, I'd love to see it. I would tell you to tag me, except that I am not cool and I don't have an Instagram, or a Twitter, or much of anything. But let me know down in the comments. If you have any questions, you can leave them down there too, and I will do my best to respond. There you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time. Bye! I know what you're thinking. Her stitches are so uneven. They're all over the place. Okay, yeah? Watch somebody else's sock upcycling video then. I will have cute mittens, and you will be a grump on the internet.